A driver crossed the line on the podium, the champagne was ready, the cameras were waiting, and then Formula One took it all away over a number so tiny most people would never even notice it. But that was not the scandal. The real scandal came when the governing body admitted the measuring system was wrong, gave one driver his result back, and left other teams with damage they may never be able to recover. Now McLaren is fighting back. Mercedes is furious. Red Bull has been dragged into the chaos. And the biggest question is no longer who deserved the penalty. The biggest question is whether Formula One just exposed a broken system that can punish teams, change championships, and still have no way to fully fix its own mistakes. Because if this happened once, it can happen again, and next time, it might decide the title. Subscribe to the channel. At first, the paddock tried to treat this like a normal Formula One argument. A driver gets a penalty. A team gets angry. Fans split into two sides. One side says the rules are the rules, and the other side says common sense has disappeared again. That is usually how these stories work. The outrage burns hot for a few hours, everyone argues online, the next Grand Prix arrives, and the sport quietly moves on. But this one did not move on. Because the deeper teams looked, the worse the problem became. Monaco was supposed to be a rare moment of relief for Alpine. Not just a good result, not just a lucky afternoon, but the kind of result that can change the feeling inside an entire garage. Pierre Gasly had crossed the line in third place, and for a team fighting to prove it still belonged near the front, that podium mattered more than the trophy itself. It was proof. Proof that the strategy had worked. Proof that the driver had delivered. Proof that all the long nights, all the pressure, all the questions around the team had not been for nothing. And then, almost instantly, that proof was pulled away. Two separate time penalties. Both for speeding in the pit lane. Both small enough to sound harmless to anyone outside Formula One. But in this sport, harmless numbers can destroy everything. The recorded speeds were just above the limit. Not wildly over. Not reckless. Not dangerous in the way fans imagine danger. Just a tiny margin, a fraction that most people would barely understand unless they saw the result attached to it. And that is where the first uncomfortable question appears. If the difference was so small, why did the punishment feel so enormous? Gasly did not just lose a few seconds on a timing screen. He lost a podium. Alpine lost one of its biggest emotional moments of the season. And the entire race result changed after the checkered flag, when the drivers were already out of the cars and the fans thought they knew what they had just watched. That alone would have been controversial. But then Alpine came forward with the detail that changed the entire story. They argued that Gasly had activated the pit lane speed limiter before entering the pit lane. That matters because the limiter is not a suggestion. It is not a driver guessing with his right foot. It is a system designed to stop the car from breaking the speed limit in that exact moment. So if the limiter was on, and the car was supposedly still speeding, something did not add up. And that is when the story stopped being about Gasly making a mistake. It became about whether the system measuring him had failed. That sounds technical, but it is actually simple. Imagine getting a speeding ticket from a camera, then finding out the camera was using the wrong distance to calculate your speed. You can argue with a police officer about judgment, but you cannot argue with broken math. If the measurement is wrong, the punishment may look official, but it is built on a mistake. That is why teams became alarmed. Because Formula One survives on trust. Teams trust the timing screens. Drivers trust the pit lane systems. Engineers trust the data. Fans trust that when a result is posted, it means something real. But if the measuring system was wrong in Monaco, then every decision based on that system suddenly becomes questionable. And this is where the problem begins to spread. Because Gasly was not the only one caught in the consequences. George Russell's race was also pulled into the chaos. Mercedes believed the penalty situation changed what could have been a completely different result for him. Once a penalty is served during a race, the damage cannot be neatly removed afterward. It changes strategy. It changes track position. It changes how rivals react. It changes the entire story of the Grand Prix. That is the part people miss. A Formula One penalty is not just a number added to a screen. It is a chain reaction. One decision can force a team to change the plan. That new plan can put the driver in traffic. The traffic can damage the tires. The tire damage can stop an overtake. The missed overtake can cost points. And those points can matter months later, when the championship is being decided by the smallest possible margin. So when the governing body later acknowledged that there had been a measurement discrepancy in the pit lane timing loops, it did not calm the controversy. It made it bigger. Because now the paddock was facing a question no team wanted to ask out loud. What happens when the official system creates an unofficial result? And the answer was even worse than the question. Gasly could be restored because his penalties were added after the race. But drivers who had already served penalties during the race were trapped inside the version of events the error had created. There was no clean rewind, no simple reset, no perfect way to rebuild the race as it should have happened. And that is why this scandal became so dangerous. Not because Formula One made a mistake. Mistakes happen. The real problem is that once the mistake affected live race strategy, the sport had no complete way to repair it. That is what turned a pit lane penalty into a crisis. And for the teams watching from the garage, one thought became impossible to ignore. If the system can do this to Alpine and Mercedes today, it can do it to anyone tomorrow. Then came the part that made the entire paddock nervous. Because once Alpine challenged the penalties, the story was no longer about whether one driver had crossed a pit lane line too quickly. It was about who knew the system was wrong, when they knew it, and why the stewards were still allowed to make decisions without the full picture. That is the question teams hate most. Not because it is dramatic. Because it is dangerous. A bad call can happen in any sport. A referee can miss contact. A steward can judge a racing move too harshly. A driver can feel robbed, a team can complain, and people can still accept that human judgment is imperfect. But Monaco was not just judgment. It was measurement. And measurement is supposed to be the safest part of Formula One. The sport can argue forever about whether a driver left enough space, whether an overtake was fair, or whether a defensive move was too aggressive. Those decisions live in the gray area. They depend on angles, context, timing, and interpretation. But pit lane speed is supposed to be black and white. Either the car was above the limit, or it was not. Either the system measured correctly, or it did not. And that is why this scandal cut so deep. Because when the measuring tool becomes the problem, the whole argument changes. It is like standing on a scale, being told you gained weight overnight, and then discovering the scale was broken before you even stepped on it. The number still looked real. The result still looked official. But the truth underneath it was already damaged. That is exactly what teams feared had happened in Monaco. Alpine's argument was explosive because it pointed beyond Gasly's car. They were not only saying their driver should not have been punished. They were suggesting the pit lane timing loop had a measurement problem, and that the data used to calculate speed may have been wrong for more than one car. That matters because Formula One teams do not make decisions in isolation. Everything is connected. A driver enters the pit lane based on what the team believes is safe. The team sets procedures based on the rules. Engineers trust that the official systems are calibrated correctly. Strategists assume that if the driver follows the process, the result will be predictable. But if the official system is giving flawed readings, then every team is suddenly racing inside a trap. Drive normally, and you might be punished. Drive carefully, and you might lose time to rivals. Challenge the result, and you might start a legal war. Accept the result, and you might throw away points you should have kept. There is no clean option. And that is where McLaren enters the story. When Gasly was restored to the podium, Alpine had reason to feel vindicated. But McLaren saw the same decision from a completely different angle. Because if Gasly gets his result back, someone else loses the position they had inherited. Oscar Piastri was part of that reshuffle. McLaren had every reason to ask whether the correction of one mistake had created another unfair outcome for them. Their argument was not just emotional. It was strategic. McLaren's concern was that some teams may have acted cautiously because they understood there was a measurement issue, or because they believed the safest way to avoid penalties was to protect themselves in the pit lane. If a team slows down more than it normally would, that caution costs time. And in Formula One, time is not a detail. Time is the currency of everything. A tenth can decide track position. A slow pit entry can decide whether a car comes out in clean air or behind traffic. A cautious procedure can decide whether a podium lives or dies. So McLaren's question was brutal. If one team gets relief after the system is corrected, what happens to the teams that adjusted to survive the same system? That is why their appeal matters. It is not just about trying to undo Gasly's restored podium. It is about forcing the governing body to answer a deeper question. Can a correction be fair if it only corrects one side of the damage? And once that question is asked, the entire result becomes unstable. Red Bull had its own reason to pay attention. Isaac Hadjar had been pulled into the consequences of the shifting result. At one point, the penalty chaos placed him in a position that would have meant something enormous for his career. Then the review changed the picture again. For a young driver, a first podium is not just a line on a results sheet. It changes how people talk about you. It changes how your team sees you. It changes your confidence, your reputation, and sometimes even your future. So when that moment appears and then disappears through no fault of your own, the frustration is not hard to understand. This is the part that makes the scandal feel impossible to solve. Gasly can argue he was robbed by a faulty system. Piastri and McLaren can argue they were disadvantaged by the correction. Hadjar and Red Bull can argue they were caught in the middle of a result they did not create. Russell and Mercedes can argue their race was damaged in a way that cannot be undone. And somehow, all of them can be right. That is when a controversy becomes a crisis. Because the sport is no longer choosing between right and wrong. It is choosing which unfairness it is willing to leave standing. And there is another layer that makes teams even angrier. The cost of fighting back has changed. The protest fee jumped from €2,000 to €20,000. That is not a small adjustment. That is a message. It tells teams that challenging decisions is now much more expensive, even when the challenge may be legitimate. The official reason is easy to understand. Nobody wants pointless protests after every race. Nobody wants teams throwing paperwork at the governing body just because they are frustrated. But the danger is just as obvious. A higher fee does not only block weak protests. It can also discourage serious ones. For the biggest teams, €20,000 may not stop a legal challenge. But Formula One is not only the biggest teams. Smaller teams have to weigh every decision. Even when they believe the system has failed them, the price of asking for justice has become heavier. And that creates an uncomfortable imbalance. The governing body can make an error that changes a race. But the team trying to prove that error must pay more than ever just to open the door. That is not how trust is rebuilt. It is how pressure builds behind the walls. And by the time pressure reaches this level, every future penalty becomes suspicious. That is the real danger for Formula One. Not one angry weekend. Not one podium dispute. Not one appeal. The danger is that teams start racing the rule system as much as they race each other. Drivers become cautious in places where instinct should guide them. Engineers start questioning official numbers they once accepted. Strategists begin planning for legal consequences instead of pure performance. Fans stop celebrating results immediately because they know the final order might change hours, or even days, later. That is a disaster for a sport built on the power of the checkered flag. The flag is supposed to mean the race is over. The argument can continue, but the result should feel real. Monaco made that feeling weaker. Because when Gasly crossed the line, fans saw one story. When the penalties arrived, they saw another. When the review reversed the penalties, they saw a third. And when McLaren appealed, they realized the story still might not be finished. That is not clarity. That is erosion. Slowly, result by result, decision by decision, the ground beneath the sport starts to feel less solid. And Formula One cannot afford that. Because the cars are already complicated. The strategies are already difficult to follow. Tire degradation, pit windows, undercuts, overcuts, safety cars, track limits, stewarding notes, penalty points, team appeals, all of it can be overwhelming for casual fans. But complexity is acceptable when the conclusion feels honest. People can handle a complicated sport. They cannot handle a sport where the result feels temporary. That is why this scandal is bigger than a pit lane speed limit. It attacks the one thing every race needs. Belief. Belief that the fastest legal result wins. Belief that the rules apply the same way to everyone. Belief that if the sport makes a mistake, it has the courage and the structure to fix it properly. And right now, after Monaco, that belief has been shaken. The teams are not only lashing out because they lost positions. They are lashing out because they have seen the flaw. A penalty can be issued instantly. A result can be changed quickly. But once the consequences spread through a live Grand Prix, the system may not be able to put everything back where it belongs. And that means the next controversial penalty will arrive with a shadow over it. Not just, was the driver guilty? But, can Formula One prove the system was right before it punished him?